which is called Katrina 20, the Future of Education in New Orleans. I'm the director of the Future Learning Network here at the Progressive Policy Institute. So excited to be here with two amazing speakers. Today's event is co-sponsored by the 74. The Reinventing America Schools project is housed here at the Progressive Policy Institute and promotes a model of schools we call 21st century school systems, or systems that provide parents with more choice and give schools more autonomy in return for more accountability. Our research shows that public school systems that do this produce the most rapid improvement in student performance. Today's webinar will address the state of education in New Orleans 20 years after Hurricane Katrina and how what we've learned will impact the future of public education in the city. Before we get to my amazing panelists and have them introduce themselves, we want to take a survey. We do this to give the speakers a sense of who's listening so that when they're answering questions, they can kind of get a sort of a take on maybe areas they should emphasize. So for those who registered here, please indicate which group you most identify with, particularly as it relates to this conversation, whether it be a parent, educator, funder, journalist, advocate, or policymaker. And I'll be honest with you, at some point in time in my life, I probably fit into about 3 or 4 or 5 of these categories. But particularly for this conversation, how do you come to this space and how are you listening to this conversation? We're going to give that answer back to our speakers in a second. But without further ado, I will throw it over to Rachel Canter to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm happy to be here with everyone on the call. I'm Rachel Canter. I'm the Director of Education Policy, and along with Curtis, and part of the Reinventing America Schools project here at the Progressive Policy Institute. I am originally from Mississippi and spent most of my career in Mississippi in the classroom and then leading a state-based education policy organization for the last 17 years.
Thank you so much. Dana. And you're muted there, Dana.
My apologies. Great to be here with you, Curtis and Rachel. Dana Peterson. I run New Schools for New Orleans, a local education funding and advocacy group here in New Orleans. I have been involved in education in New Orleans since the storm. I started out as a volunteer charter school board member almost 20 years ago and have worked in various leadership roles, and most recently was an assistant state superintendent, and now run what is a nonprofit organization that supports public schools in the city.
No, this is exciting. I'm glad to have both of you all here from Mississippi, from Louisiana, but folks who are actually actively responding and addressing education in the region, but also have been authorities on this conversation throughout the country. Before we jump into our first question, I do want to get the results of our survey to see who's listening. So a good, we have journalists here, we have educators, we have policymakers, we have advocates, and people are still coming in as the conversation is going. So as you are listening in, people are writing about this. They're curious about how to talk about what's happening in New Orleans. And so this gives you an opportunity to sort of shape that. So before we go forward, I want to go back a little bit, and we sort of talked about this a little bit before folks joined in. And so Rachel, let's just sort of put ourselves back into the summer of 2025. Where were you when Hurricane Katrina first hit New Orleans?
I was in my second year in the classroom in August of 2005. I taught in a small town called Greenville, which is right on the Mississippi River in the Mississippi Delta. If you get on Highway 61 in New Orleans and you just come north a couple hours, you will eventually run into Greenville, Mississippi. And that's where I was. I was driving to school in the morning at around 6 a.m. when the storm made landfall and hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast and hit Katrina and hit New Orleans. And the Delta flooded. The storm was that strong that even 5 hours north of the coast, the water, the wind, and the rain were so strong the Delta flooded. So I have a very vivid memory of that day, and a vivid memory of thinking as I was listening to the radio reporting on the storm coming ashore that New Orleans and our Mississippi Gulf Coast communities would probably never be the same.
And as you mentioned before, you were a classroom teacher. What did you teach? Where did you teach? What school?
I taught 7th grade English language arts, in Coleman Middle School, which is in Greenville, Mississippi, which is about 2 hours west of my hometown of Starkville, Mississippi.
Dana, where were you? I mean, you're a native of Louisiana. Where were
I'm
you?
not, I'm actually not a native. I had moved to New Orleans 2 years prior to the storm, but when the
Okay.
storm hit, I, like a lot of people, had evacuated. I was watching from a hotel room in Orlando with my wife's family, just sort of watching in shock and certainly horror with what had happened. I think it's important for folks to know, the city was hit with that Category 4 storm on the 29th, but it was the next day when really chaos broke, when overnight the levees, recognition that the levees had breached and water started entering the city. And that's when what we started to see on television, those images, certainly were pretty horrific. And, your attention immediately turns to, when can you get back to the city and be a part of the cleanup.
And so, right after the storm, there were a lot of conversation about what was going to happen with New Orleans. Actual debates, whether they're going to bring New Orleans back at all,
Yeah.
whether they should rebuild the city, whether the city sort of just naturally in a bad spot, in a so-called bowl. And there are folks particularly on the ground in the region, Rachel, who are really fighting for the future of the city. But also there are a lot of conversations about life before the city. Well, narratives about, what life was like for people there. And there have been different versions that people talk about. And it's important that folks on the ground who were there, drive those conversations. And so in the weeks and months after the storm, again, there were multiple versions of narratives of life, particularly what was life like for children, for students? What were the schools like prior to the storm? And so, Dana, in the work that you've done at the school level as a board member, but also at the state level, how do you describe life for students in New Orleans immediately prior to the hurricane?
Yeah, it's a great question, Curtis. I would say for young people, I think, and I spent some time inside of schools before the storm, working with a community organization that would run a civic engagement program for young people. So I spent some time recruiting kids in high schools to be part of a civic engagement program that taught them about the importance of voting and being civically engaged. I would say young people were largely happy before the storm, even though not enough young people were thriving maybe academically within schools. But I think, if you know anything about New Orleans culture and how strong the culture is, and I think a lot of young people were thriving in that sense in their schools, in their communities, in their neighborhoods, even if they were doing so in school or in a school system that was less than ideal. I think one more important point here is, you talk about narratives and different narratives being told. There's been this narrative, I think, that's been told that the community itself was largely okay with what was going on inside of schools, and nothing could be further from the truth. If you looked at local news reports, if you watched a school board meeting before the storm, there was certainly angst amongst a lot of people in this community who were unsatisfied with the state of that school system before the storm. The year before the storm in 2004, 5 of the 7 school board seats were turned over precisely because people in this local community were pushing on the school system of what it was, what was it going to do or not do in order to improve outcomes for young people. So there was a lot going on there and a lot being said and debated and discussed about about the state of things before the storm.
No, thank you. I mean, again, from what I hear, and again, I defer to a lot of folks who were there, and a lot of it is sort of put in the context of what happens after the storm.
Yeah.
And a lot has to do with, you know, the makeup of the teachers, the background, the experience, the connection they had with their students, and what it looked like after. And so those are things that we'll talk about a little bit in the conversation. But I want to get into the numbers. And Rachel, you wrote a recent report about education in New Orleans, you know, prior to the storm, but also since then, and all the reforms and the impact it's had. But I want to kind of stick before the storm. And so in your recent report, you chronicled this, what life was like for students academically in 2005. What did you discover in your report?
I think it's no secret that academically, the schools in New Orleans, the public schools in New Orleans, were woefully inadequate for the vast majority of students that attended them. High school graduation rate was really low. Only about half of students who went to a public high school in New Orleans graduated. You had a lot of schools that were failing or designated as failing by the state. In the city of New Orleans, you had pretty low reading and math rates on the state assessment at that point in time. You just had a lot of kids who were really struggling in their educational journey, and because of that, a lot of them didn't finish high school, and the matriculation rate into college was also pretty low. And when you start to look at the factors or the reasons behind that, you do see that the system itself was broken. And that was, I always tell people that when systems are broken, that is not the fault of the children in that system, it's the fault of the adults in that system. And there were a lot of adults who were connected to the city schools who were participating in corruption, where there was just a lot of, there were people on the payroll who had not worked there in a really long time. The city schools were on the verge of bankruptcy. They were desperately trying to save the school district from bankruptcy right before the storm. So there were a lot of systemic problems that when you get down to the classroom level, what that means is that teachers don't have what they need to help students learn, and students are not getting the education they deserve.
I think, all of what Rachel described, of course, is been well documented and accurate. I think you also have to layer on top of that cities, particularly in the Deep South, like New Orleans was, and what the legacy of disinvestment and inequitable treatment had, the lasting effect of that on creating a system that existed prior to Hurricane Katrina. Like, it all goes together and builds on itself. New Orleans has long been, I think, this representative of this real dichotomy, between, like, you got this really strong culture that that attracts people from all over the world, right? But it exists within the context of being in the Deep South, being at the root of it being slavery, decades of segregation and unfair treatment, and all of that contributed to, of course, the milieu that existed when Hurricane Katrina came.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly right. And we also see that in Mississippi, where we've had, in various places in Mississippi, we have decades of, you have a history of, before Brown v. Board, you had two completely parallel systems. After Brown 2, really, when the federal government said, no, we're serious about this, you do have to integrate. And you had white flight out of a lot of our local public schools. And then with that white flight also, taking away a lot of the power and the money that were invested in the school districts. And then through the 90s in Jackson, where I spent 2 decades, we also saw Black middle class flight. And that meant that you really had a hollowing out of the the school district's capacity and ability to address the challenges that it had. And over time, what you see people in power who cling to their power, and they're completely divorced from people in the community who are trying to get a quality education for their child in the school district, which is the only option that many of them have.
Right.
And so for a lot of you who are listening in, and you're wondering, not wondering, but recalling where you were in 2005 or what you heard about New Orleans, a lot of what was happening in New Orleans operates in a context of a lot of where urban education was in that same period of time. And those who are listening saying, well, I was in Washington, D.C. And I remember when, Michelle Rhee came in, and I was in Chicago, or I might have been in New York, or I might have been in L.A. And so while what happened in New Orleans obviously put this particular school district at the forefront, a lot of folks around the country were looking at, again, No Child Left Behind policies, and how education was being meted out to particularly low-income families. But at the same time, this natural disaster hits New Orleans, and those who are in New Orleans listening saying, Curtis, I know the storm hit on one day, but the levee broke the following day. And that's where, if the levee had never broke, we'd be having a conversation about a lot of this stuff. And that's sort of where I want to go. Because in the years following the storm, various systems and structures were created to, in many ways, reimagine the future of schools and school governance in New Orleans, including the State Recovery School District, which Dana, I want you to address. At the same time, there was sort of this organizational, institutional partners like charter school operators and Teach for America, who were approached by the city, in some cases also volunteered in many ways, raised their hand, and we're there to really address in some cases, school closure, school governance issues that you highlighted, Rachel, but also teacher shortages, which were a function of a lot of this people being displaced. And so, Dana, someone and you could sort of share your role with the State Recovery School District as well. What lessons did this era in New Orleans redevelopment teach us, particularly the 2 or 3 or 4 years after the storm, and how both the city but also the country came together to, in many ways, reimagine, or some would say redevelop, the city school system?
Yeah, I think there are a number of important lessons. One, first off, is the spirit of, America really came to support New Orleans, right? And there were lots of resources, whether they were money or people, were drawn to New Orleans and supported New Orleans, to get back on its feet. And that's, and we thank the rest of the country and the world for that, for that support. Another thing to note, of course, is the storm disrupted every aspect of life in New Orleans. It wasn't just the school system. That might have been most pronounced in the school system, in part because of some of the challenges that Rachel described that existed before the storm, the state's action to take over schools after the storm. But to be sure, it disrupted every aspect of New Orleans. And, for that period of the first 5 years after the storm, civic engagement really went through the roof in New Orleans, because people locally wanted to be involved in the rebuild of the city in all of its ways and aspects, right? And we benefited certainly from that in education in New Orleans. At some point, I would say once the state got its feet underneath it in the Recovery School District, then I think there became a clear sense of, one, a focus on equity, right? We wanted to create more equitable opportunities for young people. And so a series of policies, of course, over the years gets developed trying to advance this, whether it be school choice as a value, like we believe in the power of families to be able to choose schools. But that certainly started just from a practical standpoint, because the city was rebuilding kind of unevenly. You needed a way to apply fairly to go to schools in the city, and a way to allocate what had become really precious, right? So, but equitable policies like school choice. Ultimately, we landed on a differentiated funding formula that says, hey, if school kids with particular needs are landing in particular schools, then it stands to reason that those schools should have more resources to address the needs of those young people, right? That was about creating more equitable outcomes and opportunities for young people. So the main legacy, I think, of this period is that we began to have a real deep sense of focus on we want to have a more equitable system. And you have to remember, we're rebuilding a system too. A lot of people look at New Orleans and say, hey, it's an all charter school system, and this idea of what does it mean to be a charter school versus having traditional schools? But you had to also rebuild the system around those charter schools, right? So how are we going to ensure fairness and equity and a level playing field, not just between families, but between schools as well, right? Who have a lot of autonomy and say in the way in which they're going to operate their schools, but the school system itself saying, but yes, we believe that we're going to guard the gate, if you will, on how kids get into schools, how kids are exited from schools, as a way to ensure fairness and equity for families. So the real legacy, I think, from that period, right, is yes, we implemented a set of values that are rooted in autonomy and accountability and choice and whatnot. But it was really this idea of fairness and equity became everything for us. So every piece of policy that we were seeking to advance, it was rooted in this idea of we're trying to create a fairer, more equitable school system so we can lessen this gap between the perceived haves and have-nots, if you will.
And
I
just
think
briefly,
it's a piece of work. It's a piece of work that I think I and many who contributed to that to this day are very proud of that, because right now it serves as the foundation that we've built in New Orleans, and we think it's contributed a lot to the success that we've had.
For those who don't know, and I want to speak over anybody's head or assume anything, can you briefly explain what the State Recovery School District was,
Yeah.
and what powers it
Yeah.
had and how it was created for those who don't know?
Yeah. So the State Recovery School District actually was created before the storm. It was created in 2003 by way of state legislation. It just coincidentally was called the Recovery School District, right? Because it was designed to have the state intervene in low performing school systems and recover those schools to be to meet whatever the state's academic requirements were. It had taken on a handful of schools in New Orleans before the storm, and I think a couple of those schools were just getting restarted days before, maybe weeks before Hurricane Katrina hit, when schools started in the fall of 2005. After the storm, in the first sort of special legislative session, I believe in October or November of 2005, the governor and then the state moved to take over what was the overwhelming majority of public schools in New Orleans that did not meet the state's bar. It placed them into the Recovery School District, and then the state became responsible for more than 3/4 of schools in New Orleans. Now, it's important to know, Curtis, at that time, the state was in no better position to run schools in New Orleans than the previous New Orleans school system was, right? Because it did not have the infrastructure in order to do that. But of course, as I said a few moments ago, it took a while for it to get its feet underneath it, and then decide, hey, we're going to use charter schools as a main strategy in school improvement. And organizations like the one that I run now, New Schools for New Orleans, and others set out to sort of how do we incubate charter school leaders, there were federal resources to help incubate new schools and then build the system that ultimately start to build the system that ultimately you see today.
No, thank you for clarifying.
And one last point is, in 2016, of course, we passed legislation to return schools from the Recovery School District back to local governance under the elected Orleans Parish School Board. That process was completed in 2018, although that system looks decidedly different today than it did back in 2005. So we have a system nearly of 100% charter schools that are sort of independently operated and governed, but the school system and the board sort of establishes policy, expectations, distributes funding, et cetera.
No, that's incredibly helpful, and I'm sure folks are listening in and are quite surprised by how you explain the recovery district, and that the idea that in some way coincidence that people learned about it after the storm, that there was a connection. Rachel, as you mentioned at the beginning, you were in the region. Mississippi was also hit by the storm, and you were an educator, and you were in the classroom, and you had students from New Orleans who were displaced and in your building. So, what lessons did you learn in Mississippi, and what did you take from those lessons into work that you did in the work years after when you started your organization there in Mississippi?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't now. It's hard to remember that it wasn't like flipping a switch. It wasn't like the storm came, the city was flooded for 2 weeks, and then now we have an all charter city. That is not how it happened at all. That first 2 years was really messy, frankly. You had the state takeover process. There were so many people displaced. They didn't even know how many children were going to come back. They didn't know if educators were going to come back. And then, of course, the district was basically bankrupt, so it released all these educators. There was no capacity in the recovery school district to run schools. And I think in Mississippi, especially the lower half of the state, where Mississippi is a really small place, and so when you talk about media markets, there's a huge portion of Mississippi where their major media market is actually New Orleans. Because it's the largest town nearby them. And then you have the Jackson media market and you have the Memphis media market. And so you're in Mississippi, you get news about the people outside of you. So you are, we were watching what is happening in New Orleans. I had kids in my classroom who had evacuated from the storm. I had teachers in my school who had been teachers in New Orleans, had been New Orleanians their entire lives and came to Greenville because they didn't have anywhere else they could go. And that's what it was like for, that first year. On the Mississippi Gulf Coast, you also had a number of communities that were completely wiped out by Katrina. There's pictures in our state newspaper of just lumber. And that's what the Gulf Coast looked like, because the storm surge just leveled all the houses and the schools below Highway 90 in those lower 3 counties. But many of our Mississippi Gulf Coast communities are more affluent than a lot of the neighborhoods in New Orleans, and those communities were able to rebuild their schools. They had insurance to rebuild their homes. They were able to do it. It wasn't easy, and I know a lot of people that I'm very close to who live on the Gulf Coast who it's still an extremely painful memory for them. And when the 20th anniversary came back, they didn't necessarily want to commemorate it because it was just so painful. But I think that you had capacity in school districts on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and you had a lot of support from our state that they were able to rebuild. It wasn't like in New Orleans where there were just these questions like, you don't even have an infrastructure to be able to rebuild schools. And so we watched this process evolve over time. And I remember hearing Paul Pasterek speak in 2009 about what was going on in New Orleans. And we were very curious because Mississippi didn't have a working charter law until 2013. So we wanted to know, like, is this really an opportunity? Will this provide an opportunity for children that Mississippi can copy? We were also doing our own school turnaround work, looking at state takeover of schools. And I think that New Orleans, because they had to go through that process, we learned a lot about what to do and what not to do. And some of these lessons in New Orleans around equity, around accountability, are really, I think, key lessons, not just for Mississippi, but anywhere in the United States, who are trying to, expand educational opportunity and remake schools that everybody can recognize are broken, but it can be really hard to make those decisions about what to do about them.
I think Rachel, one thing Rachel raises that comes to mind for me, we can look at the data today and so to know empirically we have a more improved system, right? Plus 25 on graduation rates, nearly plus 30 on college going rates. Today, New Orleans surpasses the state average in terms of the percentage of kids who go into college directly out of high school. Like that, and today we have zero failing schools in the city. And all of that, I think is remarkable. But one thing is absolutely true, and a recognition of a stronger system is that today's system has a stronger foundation from which to build upon. So God forbid we were to have another Katrina today. The school system is in a vastly different position, organizationally, financially, and in other respects that could allow it to withstand in the aftermath the way other school systems, some in Louisiana, just neighboring St. Bernard Parish, was in a stronger position to withstand similar levels of devastation, but just had a stronger financial base foundation from which to operate. And so kudos to leaders in the NOLA public school system, and the board that operates it, right, has been really responsible and responsive over the past several years in building a system that not only, of course, is adaptive, right, which is our main, I think, superpower, but it is also just has a stronger foundation from which to operate. And you saw that in our COVID response. It's how the system sort of immediately went into response mode in ways that other systems around the state lagged. So I think it's just evidence of how we've rebuilt something that's stronger and more resilient. And I say resilient, knowing full well some folks locally really don't like that we have to use that word to describe ourselves, but I think it is true that we are a more resilient school system today.
I want to thank you both, because you all both really highlight key aspects of what even our predecessor David Osborne chronicled in his book Reinventing American Schools about New Orleans, and about why it was succeeding post Katrina. It wasn't simply because it was turned into a charter school district, and that those who were supportive of charter said, "See, I told you so." There were these aspects of what charters bring that, at least he said, and I think a lot of us since then have tried to highlight and tried to say other traditional school districts can do if they had the wherewithal and interest to do so. And you mentioned one, Dana, which is this idea of choice, that sort of zip code and income should not be a determinant in the school you attend, the quality of the school, the type of school, the school model, schools that actually speak to the individual gifts and interests of a child. This idea of autonomy, the idea that you give school leaders in the building power over how the school is run with regard to the length of the school day, in some cases school year, hiring of staff, curriculum, and all the things that a lot of school leaders that are listening now are saying, yeah, in a traditional public school system, large bureaucracies, I just don't have a lot of the power and a lot of the delays that happen trying to get things done. But lastly, I think you all, again, both highlight this idea of accountability, that for, again, not just in New Orleans, but in many districts around the country, that schools were failing students and there were no repercussions and there were no consequences. And for those who are, who oppose charter, and everyone has reason, I think we are constantly reminding folks that charter schools in many cases have that sense of having that charter revoked or not renewed, hanging over their head every 3 to 5 years. And the response and the need to really meet the needs that's outlined in the charter, but also to the constituents and boards like those in New Orleans that hold them accountable, are that level of accountability that a lot of these foundations that you mentioned, Dana, require. And so, audience, and you all listening, I want to go back to you all, audience, and this is our question to you. Of the three, choice, autonomy, and accountability, what do you think is the most important aspect of the New Orleans Reformation story, but also to you where you live? what aspect of your school system right now do you believe would be most beneficial? Do you believe where you live, you all should have more choice? Do you believe where you live, the school leaders in the school buildings should have more autonomy over how the school is run? Or do you believe the schools in your district, traditional public schools, public charter schools, should have more accountability, and that would be the key to improving? And so as you all are answering that question, I do want to go back to you all. And again, then you kind of tease us out a little bit as well, but I want to go back to your report, Rachel. Let's talk about New Orleans 2025. Where are they now? And folks who are sort of just learning about New Orleans and sort of tuning in, what would they find if they arrived there in New Orleans in a classroom, in a school building? What would they see by the numbers?
Mm-hmm. So as Mr. Peterson says, the district is in a vastly different place. And the district, I mean, all of the schools that would fall under the Orleans Parish School Board, all the charter schools, and then the direct run school. And we've seen dramatic gains in graduation rates and college matriculation rates. We've seen big improvements on reading and math on the state assessments. And this is even though Louisiana, like many other states in the country, raised standards and rigor in their assessments throughout, the mid 2010s. And despite the fact that Louisiana raised its bar, you still see improvement all the way up until the COVID period in the New Orleans schools. COVID hit everybody across the country like a ton of bricks. You saw that also in the data in New Orleans, but you are now seeing a recovery from COVID in the data in New Orleans as well on that reading and math. But before the storm, the majority of schools designated as failing in Louisiana were in New Orleans. And now there's zero. As Mr. Peterson said, there's 0 schools that are designated as failing, and there are 5 schools statewide in Louisiana that are designated as failing. So it's a tremendous success story in terms of educational outcomes for kids. It hasn't been without growing pains, as I'm sure that we can talk about, learning those hard lessons about the fact that the community needed to be involved in how the recovery process took place, and taking that criticism seriously, making sure that when you had charter schools that weren't doing the job, that you were closing those schools and making sure you were supporting families and making the right choices for them. All of these things were hard lessons learned along the way. But if you look at the data, there's no question that if you are a child now and you're going to a public school in New Orleans, you will have better educational outcomes than a child 20 years ago.
Yeah. And just to put an even finer point on what Rachel described, we learned recently because this didn't just affect New Orleans, it affected, I think, the entire state and how the state has approached the work of school improvement, the spread of choice around the state. New Orleans has been fortunate to have had over the past much of the past 20 years, like we've had leaders at the State Department of Education who really passionately cared about New Orleans. You mentioned Paul Pastorik, John White, who was the Recovery School District Superintendent before becoming the state superintendent, and served as state superintendent for quite some time. Like, we had leaders at the state who really cared about New Orleans. In the years since COVID, we've learned that the state has led the country, outpaced the country in academic recovery in both reading and math. And over the past several years, New Orleans has outpaced the state on our LEAP exams in academic recovery. So it stands to reason that New Orleans is leading the country in academic recovery in recent years. And that was a period, I'm thinking 2021, right, where we were at the legislature, 22 at the legislature, trying to hold the line on some of the New Orleans reforms, because people had forgotten that we were ground zero to some of the COVID hotspot event. Mardi Gras of 2020 was an original hotspot event. We were really restrictive in COVID policies that kept New Orleans kids physically out of school. There was another hurricane that came, Hurricane Ida in 2021. So there was a period where New Orleans kids missed more time out of school, that physically out of school buildings, than most kids in the country. And we know now that that was particularly difficult for young people, particularly young people who have fewer resources. Yet the way in which our schools have bounced back, I think, speak to the real fundamentals that are at play. And you talked about, Curtis, this idea of, is it accountability? Is it autonomy? Is it choice? Researchers, Doug Harris in particular, I'm thinking about from Tulane University, who's studied the reforms a lot, who says, hey, we haven't seen this type of dramatic growth in anywhere, and that we've sustained it. He attributes it mostly, though, to accountability. I myself, I believe something a little bit different. I think we talk about it as sort of key system values, right? We value and believe in the flexibility of educators to create the types of schools that parents might be responsive to. We believe in then holding them accountable for outcomes for young people, right? Those two things certainly go hand in hand. And we believe in the power of families to choose among those schools. And then I said it earlier, but I'll say it here again. We certainly believe in fairness and equity as powerful policy tools to help level the playing field. It is when you put all of that together, and we've done so in a very adaptive way. You can't draw a line from August 30th, 2005 straight to where we are today, right? There's a lot of, twists and turns and lessons learned along the way to get to this dynamic, unique, structure and makeup. But as you look at it today, it's all those things combined. That's why, at least from our vantage point and other advocacy groups that we partner with in the city, we're always fighting because we want to protect those key system values. Because if you start to peel away any of that, then we think is when you would have a problem. Those things have contributed to our success, certainly along with the hard work of young people, hard work of their families, hard work of educators, and the sort of creativity and innovative approaches that our charter school leaders have had. They've been real partners, of course, in creating any of the stuff that I described, right? Like, no, we didn't create an accountability system without them. An enrollment system wasn't created without them. So it is all of that when you put it together, those sort of values that we think have contributed to the strong fundamentals and foundation that we have today, that I think prepares us for what the next 20 years are going to look like for us.
And so, I mean, you all, your organization, New Schools for New Orleans, I mean, you all are telling this story.
Yeah.
You all have a report after the storm, 20 years of change and progress in New
Yeah.
Orleans public education.
Yeah.
I want to get beyond the numbers a little bit. This idea of, again, quality teachers, parental engagement, a very rigorous curriculum, Rachel talks about a lot. What about today's system is not reflected in the numbers, Dana?
Yeah, I'd say resiliency. Again, I'll go back to that word. I think, and I'm going to mean it from a couple of different, perspectives. Again, I know that it's a loaded word for some, but if you go back to Mardi Gras 2006, it was the first moment. Of course, I'm not native, right? But I had been here a few years at that point. It was that recognition that the culture here is so strong and so thick. I'd venture to say a lot of cities could not have rebounded from what Katrina was, right? So the culture itself is really strong and is served as a strong foundation by which the entire city has been able to rebuild, certainly education. If you go back, of course, to later that year, there was an election for mayor, and I remember one of the candidates saying, in order for the city to rebuild, you had to have three things needed to be true in order for you to get back to the city. You needed a job, you needed a place to live, and you needed a school for your children to go to. And imagine educators in that moment whose their own lives had been disrupted are now responsible for everyone else putting their life back together. And I think it is that type, that's just one example of the type of resilience that has been present here over the arc of this story over the last 20 years. And as we thought about in the commemoration, how we wanted to frame everything, like we wanted to make sure we were creating a space to, yes, celebrate the progress, but also make room and space for the pain and of what people have gone through over those years, and telling that story through people who lived it, breathed it, and were responsible for us getting back on our feet so then we could do all of the creative things that people have seen that have emanated from New Orleans. So to me, what the data doesn't really, tell completely, of course, is just that resilient nature of the city and its people have been present every step of the way. And so for those of us who are the outsiders, right, who have made our home here, right, like what we've done is to try to be as responsive to what we think the culture is telling us, is asking us for, is pushing us towards. And I think we've done, I think collectively, of course, have done a really good job of embracing that. And now our schools are fully embrace that. And you see that. And if you walk into an Edna Carr High School, a Carver High School, you're going to feel that immediately. That New Orleans culture is going to be present, just like it, in many ways, like it was present before the storm, just with different outcomes.
And you mentioned accountability, which is incredibly important, but I want to hear from the audience and how they view those big three. And I guess they agree with you there. And so you have more than half agree with accountability, but you also have autonomy and choice. And I think we here at Reinventing America Schools, we believe it is all three, but having that accountability to ensure that even schools of choice are held accountable. And even those school leaders who are operating with autonomy also are held accountable for student outcomes and not just simply willy-nilly, making decisions about how the school is run, but without actually seeing students succeeding. One of the greatest knocks on the story of Katrina as a Reformation story is that it isn't easily replicated because it began with a natural disaster. And so people will say, hey, see what New Orleans is doing. And oftentimes the response from those from outside of New Orleans, I was on my school board for 10 years. And a lot of the things that we were trying to push for, there was a lot of pushback because we just said, well, we don't have the governmental urgency or immediate need to do the things because of the fact of where we were. But, Dana, what about the last 20 years in New Orleans? Can other states use as a model for reforming education in light of the state of education in America? And this gets back to the recent NAEP scores around sort of stagnant math growth. And also you see PISA internationally, America's 26th right now, I think, in math in the world. What can other cities, urban cities particularly, take from New Orleans over the last 20 years to apply to their school district in their states?
Yeah. Well, I'd say, many in the city would argue, this is a story that's been in the making longer than 20 years, right? Like, as I said earlier, right, the Recovery School District was created before the storm. There was push. I think the storm is certainly a definitive moment in the arc. To me, I think about a word comes to mind to me, though, is courage. It takes courage for, the Recovery School District was created in part to remove local politics from the equation of how schools were going to be reconstituted, rebuilt, and the system itself rebuild itself. But you ultimately can't take the politics out of public policy. I learned that a long time ago, right? And within the politics, it requires courage. And there have been a number of courageous, both elected and appointed leaders, community folks, business folks, civic folks, who have stepped up to say, I'm going to do something about the challenge. I'm going to join forces with others. I'm going to roll my sleeves up and get to work. And even if we don't know fully what we're building, from the outset. So I think it requires what is replicable is this idea of people with strong courage and moral fiber saying that we can do something better for kids on behalf of kids and ourselves and our community, and recognize that by focusing on our school system and giving it the resources that it needs, we can do something about it. Now, you don't need a storm in which to accomplish that, hopefully. One of the things that we've said is you certainly could take the idea of holding schools accountable for academic outcomes as a baseline. That can be replicated. And they don't have to be charter schools in order to be held accountable for student outcomes and performance. But it's this idea that we're going to not only say, here's the bar, but there are consequences for not meeting the bar. Like that's the difference there. That has happened in New Orleans. And we think that lesson is spreading to other places, certainly around the state and around the country. And we think that part of it is replicable, right? This idea of you need courageous leaders in all manner of leadership positions, not just electeds, but people in government, inside and outside of government, who are going to have the courage to say, hey, we need to act here, and then have a sort of way in which we think is best to act, right? So we think those things are indeed replicable.
Rachel, in Mississippi, the organization Mississippi First, I mean, you were integral in passing state legislation on a myriad of issues around education, particularly reading. And so you have vivid experience in how to connect storytelling, data, holding people accountable. So how can this idea of this autonomy, accountability, and choice that really, we talk about the impact it had on Katrina, how can this be adopted in other states, and particularly state capitals or in local school board systems? What is your sort of policy prescription, more policy perspective on how you can really codify a lot of these things in states around the country?
Mm-hmm. Well, when we were debating our charter law in 2013, because we're so close to New Orleans, that was the example that a lot of our Mississippi legislators knew of. And, in some senses, it was a great example. In some senses, it was the weirdest example to pick, because there were so many things that were unique about the way in which the Katrina story happened. And I think that what we did is the same thing that other people across the country can do, which is to look at the context of New Orleans and say, what are the things that are similar? What are the things that are not? And what are the real, how do you pull out the real lessons of what they learned? I mean, when we passed our charter school law, we wanted to be really clear about autonomy and really clear about accountability. And we also want to be really clear around things like, you don't get to pick your children. If a child, everybody it's first come, first served until the school is overscribed, and then it's a lottery. And that lottery, there are specific requirements around how that lottery is run, because no one is allowed to put their finger on the scale. No one is allowed to pick their children. Families pick you. And that was a really loud and clear message that we learned from the New Orleans story, specifically around charter schools. But I do think that one of the things that is true, and I think that this word of resilience is really important, is that change requires a lot of work over time, and it doesn't get easier necessarily, but you build that muscle memory. And that muscle memory about how you go about making hard choices is something that I think the community in New Orleans has built. And that is what sets that foundation for that resilience, is that muscle memory of making hard choices over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And, whether it is a storm, whether it is just simply looking at your data and realizing it's difficult to get worse than that, and that is unacceptable for children, that could be could be your defining event. In Mississippi, when I started my work at Mississippi First, there was no necessarily, big storm. It was more just looking at the data and saying, we have to get better. This is a crisis for our children, even though we're not going to be on national news for it. And that, making the decision, we got to do something different and we got to get better. And then building that muscle memory over time is really important to the process of change.
Yeah. And we've had leader after leader after leader who has really held the line there in what Rachel said, in making the tough decisions and having the courage to make the tough decisions. Because if you set the bar and the line for what accountability should be, and then don't hold to that, then you don't have anything. I think we learned that powerful lesson many years back. And I think that's another sort of legacy of New Orleans.
Before we let you go, audience, we do have one final question. It's sort of like a culminating inquiry about what you've heard so far. And the question is a very yes or no question. Can other states and districts learn from the New Orleans story? Do you believe, yes or no, that they can? And as you're answering that, I do want to give Rachel and Dana sort of the final word in the last 3 or 4 minutes. The true test of the last 20 years in New Orleans will be measured by the strength and longevity of the institutions over the next 20 years. So, Rachel, at this rate of where progress has stands in New Orleans, what will the next 20 years of public schools look like in New Orleans to you?
I mean, I think that in terms of outcomes, if the leadership and the community in New Orleans can hold together on this shared vision for education and the children of New Orleans, I think we will continue to see that slow, steady progress, that especially after what we've seen after COVID. I think the hard thing after you have a lot of success is that it can be kind of easy for people to say, oh, well, we're doing okay now, we can slow down, or we can, we don't need to make this hard decision anymore because it's not as bad as it was. And once you start down that road of thinking, that's when you start sliding. And then, over the course of time, you end up back to where you were in the beginning. And so you have to make that choice every single day. When you wake up, and your leadership has to make that choice and the community has to make that choice. No, we don't want to go back. We want to keep going forward. And as long as the people of New Orleans keep making that choice, I think we will continue to see progress, whether that is in an all charter system or a hybrid system that has some direct run schools and some charter schools. I think over time, the actual mechanism of the school is not as important as the conditions that you've set for those schools, and making sure that you can be honest with yourself about, did we do this and it worked or not, and what do we have to do differently to keep going.
Dana, what will it take from communities, families, funders, local partners, and politicians to ensure the success of New Orleans continues over the next 20 years?
Yeah, well, so listen, part of our job is to make sure, we do keep our foot on the gas here. Look, I think in the next few, if we keep pace that we're on right now, it's important to note that in the next few years, that we're going to surpass the state average on academic outcomes. If you think about that for New Orleans relative to 20 years ago, that's amazing. I think over time, we can be the first major American city that gets it right for the majority of its kids that are coming from communities that are furthest away from opportunity. And that's going to be our legacy. And in order to get there, I think part of it is recognizing that what got us here, but we need to double down, keep our foot on the gas, whatever metaphor or cliche you want to use, but we just got to keep going and recognizing we have built the foundation for innovation. This is the most innovative place that one can come to educationally. And we need to keep investing in those people who are closest to kids, leaders, to solve the emerging challenges that we know they are confronted with. They see it first and communicate back to us what needs are. As long as we as a community commit to being responsive to those needs, we're going to reach, we're going to reach our goals.
Audience, I'm going to give you the final word and see the survey response about how many you all. So 89%, almost all of you believe that other states and districts can learn from New Orleans. And I'll definitely quote Dana, if we have the courage to do so. And don't let the good enough is often the enemy of greatness.
Yes.
And so good enough is not enough for anybody in this country. And so especially because we have the wherewithal, we have the support in your district, but as you mentioned earlier, around the country of people who want to improve education for all. And so it's just a call away. Thank you so much to Dana. Thank you so much to Rachel. Rachel, please share the title of your paper one more time and where people can find it.
So if you go to the PPI website, we are there. We're 20 years of education reform in New Orleans.
Dana, last word. Where can people learn more about your organization and what you all are doing on the 20th anniversary of Katrina?
Yeah, go to newschoolsforneworleans.org/Katrina20. And there's a lot of information there. But thank you for being here, Rachel.
No, thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for listening in. Continue to follow the work of PPI, New Schools for New Orleans. You take care. Thank you so much for joining us today.